$3,000. That's all it took to buy a man's ruin. Or so the wealthiest family in Oakhaven thought. They laughed as they handed over the deed to 40 acres of cracked, lifeless dirt, convinced they had swindled a desperate farmer out of his last dime. But they didn't know what lay buried just 18 inches beneath the dead soil. By the time they realized they had surrendered a $25 million empire, it was too late. But the real fight had just begun. Jonathan Paul was a man who measured his life in topsoil and rainfall. At 42, his face was already weathered by the harsh sun of the Midwestern plains, and his hands were permanently stained with the dark, loamy earth of his modest 10-acre vegetable farm. Jonathan was a good farmer, a man who understood the delicate chemistry of the soil, but he was drowning. 2 consecutive years of catastrophic drought and an unforgiving blight had decimated his crops. The bank was circling his family's small farmhouse, and his wife, Charlotte, was working double shifts at the county hospital just to keep the lights on. Jonathan needed more land, specifically land with access to the deeper water table, if he was going to scale his operations and save his family from bankruptcy. Enter the Caldwell brothers. Ryan and Harrison Caldwell owned nearly 60% of the arable land in Oakhaven. They were third-generation inheritors, men who wore expensive boots that had never touched mud and drove imported trucks that had never hauled a bale of hay. The town despised them, but everyone was indebted to them in one way or another. The Caldwells possessed a reputation for ruthless business practices, squeezing out independent farmers and snapping up foreclosed properties for pennies on the dollar. Jonathan knew better than to deal with the Caldwells, but desperation makes a man blind to the wolves at his door. He had heard rumors that the brothers were trying to offload a specific 40-acre parcel on the eastern edge of the county. The locals called it the Devil's Pan. It was a bizarre, sunken tract of land, surrounded by limestone ridges. For decades, nothing had grown there. The soil was a strange, chalky white in the summer, baking into a concrete-like crust that snapped plow blades in half. The Caldwells' grandfather had bought it in the 1950s, hoping to graze cattle. But the animals refused to drink from the bitter, metallic-tasting puddles that formed after the spring rains. Since then, it had sat empty, a glaring eyesore on the Caldwells' otherwise pristine portfolio. Furthermore, the county had recently reassessed property values, and the Caldwells were furious about paying taxes on an entirely useless expanse of dirt. Jonathan arranged a meeting with the brothers at Miller's Diner, a small, grease-stained establishment on the edge of town. Ryan Caldwell slid into the vinyl booth, his tailored suit a stark contrast to Jonathan's worn denim jacket. Harrison sat beside him, casually stirring his coffee with a smirk that never seemed to leave his face. "So, Jonathan," Ryan began, his voice dripping with condescension, "I hear you're looking to expand." A bold move for a man who is 2 months behind on his equipment loans. Jonathan swallowed his pride, keeping his eyes level. "I need acreage. I know you've been trying to dump the tract by the eastern ridge, the Devil's Pan." Harrison chuckled out loud. "Dump it? We're just looking for the right buyer, someone with vision." "It's dead dirt, Harrison, and we both know it," Jonathan said flatly. "It's alkali and hard pan, but it sits over the deep aquifer. If I can drill a commercial well and bring in enough organic compost, I can amend the topsoil over 3 years. I'll take it off your hands, but I'm not paying premium rates for a wasteland." Ryan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing like a predator sizing up a wounded deer. He knew Jonathan was desperate. He also knew that the Devil's Pan was practically toxic. The state environmental board had recently sent the brothers a notice regarding strange chemical runoffs from the property, threatening them with a mandatory, expensive cleanup if they didn't mitigate the erosion. The Caldwells desperately needed to transfer the liability to some poor, unsuspecting fool. $3,000, Ryan said smoothly. Cash, as is. No warranties, no environmental guarantees. You take the surface, you take the subsurface, you take it all, Jonathan, but the deal closes today. Jonathan hesitated. $3,000 was his absolute last reserve. It was the emergency fund Charlotte had painstakingly saved for their daughter's college tuition. But the promise of 40 acres and the water beneath it was too intoxicating. It was a gamble, but it was the only play he had left. "I want the mineral rights too," Jonathan countered, a standard practice for farmers who didn't want companies tearing up their fields later. Harrison laughed again. "Mineral rights? To what? The chalk and the bitter dust? Fine. Take it. The lawyer drew up the papers this morning. Sign them, give us the cashier's check, and you are the proud owner of Oak Haven's biggest litter box." Jonathan read through the contract. It was watertight. The Caldwells were legally absolving themselves of any and all liabilities associated with the land. He signed his name at the bottom of the thick parchment, sliding the envelope of cash across the sticky diner table. As Jonathan walked out of the diner, the deed clutched in his rough hands. He heard Ryan Caldwell's voice carry through the open door. "The idiot actually bought it. Call the EPA, tell them the Devil's Pan is officially Jonathan Paul's problem now." Jonathan felt a cold stone drop in his stomach. He had just bet his family's entire future on 40 acres of cursed earth. The trap had been sprung. The reality of the Devil's Pan set in the very next morning. Jonathan drove his aging John Deere tractor out to the property just as the sun crested the limestone ridges. The land stretched out before him, a barren, desolate bowl of cracked, grayish-white earth. There wasn't a single weed, not a blade of cheatgrass, defying the natural order of the wild prairie. He dropped his heavy disc plow, intending to break up the first few inches of topsoil to assess the damage. He engaged the throttle. The tractor surged forward, the heavy steel discs biting into the earth. Crack! A sound like a gunshot echoed across the silent basin. Jonathan slammed on the brakes and killed the engine. He climbed down from the cab, his heart pounding. The heavy steel shank of the plow, forged to tear through rock and root, had snapped clean in half. It hadn't hit a boulder. The soil itself was the problem. Just an inch below the powdery gray surface lay a compacted layer of something incredibly dense, almost like cured cement, yet it possessed a strange, soapy texture. For 3 weeks, Jonathan fought the land. He rented a heavy-duty ripper, burning through hundreds of dollars in diesel fuel, only to barely scratch the surface. Every evening he returned home covered in a fine, chalky dust that irritated his lungs and tasted sharply of salt and metal. Charlotte watched him with growing despair. They were receiving notices from the bank. The $3,000 was gone, and the land was proving to be entirely unworkable. "Jonathan, you have to stop," Charlotte said one evening, gently washing a deep gash on his forearm where a shattered piece of steel had caught him. "The Caldwells played us. It's a dead zone. Even if you break the crust, nothing is going to grow in that poison." "I can fix it," Jonathan muttered, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed his words. "I just need to find the bottom of this hard pan." But he couldn't. The deeper he dug, the stranger the earth became. Then, in the second week of October, the sky opened up. A massive, unseasonal storm front stalled over Oak Haven, dumping 6 inches of rain in 48 hours. The dry creek beds flash flooded, and the Devil's Pan lived up to its name, capturing the runoff from the surrounding limestone ridges and turning into a massive, shallow lake. Jonathan drove out to the property the morning after the storm broke. He expected to see a muddy disaster. Instead, he saw something that defied logic. The water in the basin wasn't muddy brown. It was a pale, almost luminescent turquoise blue. He parked his truck on the ridge and walked down toward the water's edge. The smell hit him first, a sharp, distinct odor that smelled vaguely of electrical ozone and sulfur. As he stepped into the basin, his boots didn't sink into normal mud. The ground beneath the water had transformed into a slick, viscous gel. He slipped, falling hard onto his knees and plunging his hands into the shallow, blue-tinted water. When he pulled his hands up, they were coated in a thick, clay-like substance that shimmered in the morning light. It was incredibly heavy, far heavier than any soil he had ever handled. He rubbed it between his fingers. It wasn't just clay. It felt entirely foreign, almost synthetic. Jonathan crawled toward the center of the basin, where the water had carved a deep runoff channel through the broken crust he had plowed weeks earlier. He peered down into the 3-foot trench. The gray topsoil was only a thin veneer. Beneath it, exposed by the rushing water, was a massive, continuous vein of pale, blue-gray claystone. It ran as deep as he could see, thick and unyielding. Jonathan's heart began to race. He wasn't a geologist, but a lifetime of farming, reading soil reports, and understanding earth chemistry triggered a latent memory. The Caldwells had thought the land was toxic because nothing grew. They thought it was alkali poisoning, but alkali doesn't turn water turquoise, and it doesn't smell like a lightning strike. Jonathan ran to his truck. He grabbed 3 large glass mason jars from his toolbox and rushed back down to the trench. With his bare hands, he scooped up pounds of the dense, blue clay and the turquoise water, sealing them tightly in the jars. He washed his hands furiously with a bottle of drinking water, watching the weird metallic sheen cling stubbornly to his skin. He didn't tell Charlotte. He didn't tell his neighbors. If he was wrong, he was just a desperate fool, clutching at colorful mud. But if he was right, he needed to know exactly what the Caldwell brothers had sold him. Jonathan knew better than to trust anyone in Oakhaven. The Caldwells had the local county extension office in their pockets. If he submitted soil samples there, Ryan and Harrison would know the results before Jonathan even got the phone call. Instead, he packed the heavy mason jars into a padded cooler, told Charlotte he was going into the city to look for used tractor parts, and drove 4 hours south to the State University's Department of Geological Sciences. He walked into the sprawling concrete building, feeling entirely out of place in his dusty boots and worn cap. After 2 hours of waiting and navigating bureaucratic secretaries, he finally managed to corner Dr. Simon Arris. Dr. Arris was a frantic, brilliant geochemist who specialized in rare earth formations. He looked annoyed when Jonathan walked into his chaotic laboratory, lugging the heavy cooler. "If this is about testing well water for agricultural nitrates, you're in the wrong department, Mr. Paul," Dr. Arris said, adjusting his glasses and not looking up from a microscope. "It's not water," Jonathan said, his voice steady. He unlatched the cooler and pulled out the largest mason jar, setting it on the steel counter with a heavy thud. "And it's not normal topsoil. I need an independent assay. I'm paying out of pocket." Dr. Arris sighed, finally looking up. His eyes landed on the jar. The annoyed expression vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, clinical curiosity. He walked slowly toward the counter, leaning in to inspect the dense, blue-gray sludge. "Where did you get this?" Dr. Arris asked, his voice suddenly very quiet. My farm, a 40-acre tract I just bought. It's entirely barren." Dr. Arris didn't say another word. He grabbed the jar, popped the lid, and leaned in, sniffing the air. He frowned. Using a glass pipette, he extracted a small amount of the liquid, dropped it onto a slide, and then scraped a chunk of the clay into a centrifuge tube. "Wait here," Arris commanded. Jonathan waited. For 3 agonizing hours, he sat on a hard plastic chair in the hallway, listening to the hum of massive machinery and the occasional sharp voices coming from the lab. He watched students walk by, oblivious to the farmer sitting in their midst, his entire life hanging in the balance of a chemistry test. Finally, the laboratory door swung open. Dr. Arris stood there, holding a thick stack of printouts. His face was pale, and he looked at Jonathan with a mixture of awe and deep concern. "Come inside," Arris said, locking the door behind Jonathan. Dr. Arris spread the printouts on the desk. They were covered in jagged graphs and chemical formulas that meant nothing to Jonathan. "Mr. Paul," Arris began, taking a deep breath. "Geologically speaking, the Midwest is supposed to be relatively predictable. Limestone, shale, ancient seabeds. What you brought me shouldn't exist where you live." "Is it toxic?" Jonathan asked, his chest tightening. The previous owners thought it was industrial runoff or an old dump site. "Toxic to plants? Yes, highly," Arris replied, "but it is not industrial waste. Mr. Paul, are you familiar with lithium brine deposits?" Jonathan frowned. "Lithium? Like the batteries?" "Exactly like the batteries," Arris said, tapping the paper. Most of the world's lithium comes from salt flats in South America or hard rock mines in Australia. But recently, massive deposits have been found trapped in specific claystone formations, specifically hectorite clay. The jar you brought me is not just clay. It is a hyper-concentrated lithium-boron matrix. The concentration levels in this sample are staggering. It's off the charts. Jonathan stared at him, the words struggling to connect in his brain. I don't understand. What does that mean for my land? Dr. Aris took his glasses off, rubbing his eyes. You said you own 40 acres of this, and the vein is continuous? As far as I could tell, it runs straight across the basin. Dr. Aris picked up a calculator, his fingers flying across the keys. Assuming a standard depth for a caldera deposit of this type, Mr. Paul, if this vein holds true across your 40 acres, you are sitting on one of the most accessible, high-grade lithium deposits in the hemisphere. The tech industry is starving for domestic lithium. Do you own the mineral rights? Yes, Jonathan whispered, his throat completely dry. I made sure it was in the contract. Good, Aris said, leaning in closer. Because the raw valuation of a deposit this concentrated, easily extractable from the surface. Conservative estimates put the mineral value alone at $25 million, and that's before the bidding war. The room started to spin. Jonathan gripped the edge of the desk. $25 million. The number was too big to comprehend. It was a number that broke curses, that bought towns, that crushed enemies. He had bought it for $3,000. The Caldwells had handed him an empire just to spite him. Mr. Paul, you need to listen to me carefully, Dr. Aris said, his tone suddenly urgent. You cannot tell anyone about this yet, not until you have the best mining lawyers in the state on retainer. The moment a discovery like this hits the public record, predatory energy companies will descend on you like vultures. Jonathan nodded slowly, the shock wearing off, replaced by a sudden, icy clarity. The men who sold it to me, they are ruthless. They own half the county. They own the judges. Dr. Aris looked grim. Then you are in grave danger. If they find out what they gave away for $3,000, they won't just take you to court. They will try to destroy you. They will comb through every word of that contract to find a loophole. They will claim fraud. They will claim you deceived them. They will try to invalidate the sale. You have a target on your back now. Jonathan looked at the jar of blue clay on the counter. The Caldwells thought they had buried him. They thought they had handed him the shovel to dig his own grave, but instead they had handed him the keys to the kingdom. He stood up, his shoulders squaring. The desperate, tired farmer who had walked into the building was gone. Let them try, Jonathan said, his voice cold and hard as iron. They sold me the devil's pan. Now they're going to have to deal with the devil they made. The drive back to Oak Haven felt like navigating a dream. Jonathan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were bone white. The heavy cooler sitting securely in the passenger seat, like a radioactive core. He had left Oak Haven a desperate, defeated man, clinging to the edge of ruin. He was returning as a king, in disguise, holding the deed to a lithium empire. But Dr. Aris's warning echoed in his ears with every mile marker he passed. You have a target on your back now. It was past midnight when Jonathan finally pulled his truck up to the farmhouse. The kitchen light was still on, casting a warm, solitary glow against the cold autumn night. Charlotte was sitting at the table, a stack of past-due bills spread out before her like a losing hand of cards, her head resting heavily in her hands. Jonathan walked in, quietly setting the cooler on the linoleum floor. He didn't take off his coat. He just stood there, staring at the woman who had endured years of hardship, crop failures, and bank threats, without ever leaving his side. Jonathan? Charlotte looked up, rubbing her tired eyes. Did you find the tractor parts? You've been gone for 14 hours. I was about to call the highway patrol. Jonathan walked over to her, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He gently placed his hands over the scattered bills, sweeping them into a neat pile and pushing them aside. We aren't going to need to worry about these anymore, Charlotte, Jonathan said, his voice trembling slightly. Charlotte frowned, searching his face. What are you talking about? Did you get a loan? Jonathan, tell me you didn't go to a payday lender. Jonathan knelt beside her chair. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Dr. Eris's initial laboratory printout, unfolding the crisp white paper and laying it on the table. Then he went to the cooler and retrieved the mason jar, filled with the dense, turquoise blue clay. "I didn't go to the city for tractor parts," Jonathan began, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "I went to the university. I had a geochemist test the deep soil from the Devil's Pan." Charlotte stared at the jar, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Jonathan, we already know the soil is dead. The Caldwells practically poisoned it." "It's not dead, Charlotte, and it's not poisoned," Jonathan said, his eyes locking onto hers. "It's lithium, a hyperconcentrated lithium boron matrix. The entire 40 acres is sitting on a shallow caldera deposit. The geologists said the tech companies, the battery manufacturers, they're starving for it." He took a deep breath, the magnitude of the number still catching in his throat. "Charlotte, the mineral rights we bought for $3,000, they're worth $25 million, at least." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The ancient refrigerator hummed in the corner, but the air between them had gone completely still. Charlotte looked from the jar to the paper and finally to Jonathan's face. She was looking for the punchline, searching for the madness born of desperation, but she only saw terrifying, stone-cold clarity. Tears instantly welled in her eyes, spilling over her lashes before she could stop them. She covered her mouth with her hands, a stifled, breathless sob escaping her lips. 25. "Jonathan, is this real? Are you absolutely sure?" "It's real," Jonathan whispered, pulling her into an embrace. "But we are in incredible danger. If Ryan and Harrison Caldwell find out what they gave away, they will destroy us. They will tie us up in court for decades, bankrupt us with legal fees, or worse. We have to be smart. We have to build a fortress before they even know there's a war." The very next day, the strategy began. Dr. Eris had provided Jonathan with a name: Gideon Croft. Croft was a heavyweight corporate mining attorney based out of Chicago, a man who specialized in defending independent prospectors against hostile corporate takeovers. He was known in legal circles as the Gravel Pit Bulldog, a man who thrived on tearing apart predatory contracts. Jonathan and Charlotte drained the absolute last of their savings, cashing out a small life insurance policy to pay for Croft's initial retainer, wiring the funds through a newly established LLC in Delaware to mask the origin. Their first meeting with Croft took place not in a swanky office, but in a dimly lit booth at a highway diner 3 counties over, far from the prying eyes of Oakhaven. Croft was a sharp, angular man in his late 50s, wearing a rumpled suit, but possessing eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Croft but read through the Caldwell's deed of sale while eating a plate of eggs. When he finished, he chuckled, tapping the paper with his fork. "The Caldwells outsmarted themselves," Croft said, his voice gravelly. "They were so desperate to offload the environmental liability of this toxic land that they included an ironclad, all-encompassing as-is clause and explicitly signed over the mineral rights just to mock you. Legally, they have no leg to stand on. But they own the local judges," Jonathan warned. "If they file a lawsuit claiming mutual mistake, that neither party knew the true value of the land at the time of sale, they could get an injunction. They could freeze the land so we can't mine it or sell it." Croft smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "That is precisely what they will try. The doctrine of mutual mistake is their only avenue. But to win that, they have to prove they didn't have the opportunity to discover the resource, and that the disparity in value is so great it shocks the conscience of the court. We beat that by proving they did have the opportunity. They owned it for 70 years and never bothered to test the deep soil because they were arrogant and lazy. Furthermore, we don't fight them in a local county court." "How do we avoid that?" Charlotte asked. "We go federal," Croft explained. "I'm going to file your exploratory and mining permits through the Federal Bureau of Land Management and the EPA under the guise of an interstate commerce venture. The moment the Caldwells try to file a local injunction, I will rip jurisdiction out of their pocket judge's hands and drag them into a federal courtroom in Chicago, where their small-town money means absolutely nothing." But Croft's face grew serious. However, filing federal permits takes time. Environmental impact studies, core sampling verifications, it takes months. During that time, the land has to remain secure. If the Caldwells find out before the federal shield is in place, they might resort to physical intimidation, sabotage, or worse. You have to play the fool, Jonathan. You have to convince Oakhaven that you are still a desperate, failing farmer. And so the long con began. Through the bitter winter, Jonathan played his part to perfection. He bought an old, rusted water drilling rig at a scrap auction and towed it out to the Devil's Pan. To the casual observer and to the Caldwell's spies, Jonathan was just stubbornly, tragically wasting his time trying to drill an irrigation well in dead rock. He complained loudly at the local feed store about broken drill bits and wasted diesel fuel. He let his hair grow shaggy, his clothes remain unwashed. But beneath the rusted chassis of the water rig, hidden from the road, Jonathan was not drilling for water. Guided by coordinates provided quietly by Dr. Eris, Jonathan was extracting core samples of the blue clay, sealing them in PVC pipes, and shipping them out in the dead of night via unmarked courier trucks to Croft's assayers in Chicago. Every sample came back with the same staggering news. The lithium concentration wasn't just isolated to the trench. It was a massive, continuous subsurface lake of wealth. As winter thawed into early spring, the federal paperwork was quietly making its way through the bureaucratic labyrinth of Washington and Chicago. Jonathan and Charlotte were exhausted, living a double life of immense stress. They were millionaires on paper, yet they were eating canned soup and dodging phone calls from local creditors. But the silence couldn't last forever. In a small town like Oakhaven, secrets have a scent, and predators like the Caldwells have a very keen sense of smell. Ryan Caldwell sat behind his massive mahogany desk, staring out the window of his third-floor office overlooking Oakhaven. He was bored. Crushing independent farmers usually provided a certain thrill, a sense of dominance that fueled him. But lately, the town had grown too quiet, too thoroughly subdued. His intercom buzzed. It was Dennis Albright, the manager of the local Oakhaven Savings and Loan. The Caldwells held a significant amount of leverage over Albright, essentially using the bank as an extension of their own financial intelligence network. "Ryan, I thought you should know," Albright's voice crackled through the speaker, laced with nervous confusion. "Jonathan Paul just cleared his debts." Ryan frowned, turning away from the window. "Cleared them? You mean he made his late payment on the tractor?" "No, Ryan, I mean he cleared everything. The tractor, the seed loans, the mortgage arrears on his primary farmhouse. The total was nearly $80,000. Ryan sat up straight, his boredom evaporating instantly. "That's impossible. The man was practically eating dirt. We sold him the Devil's Pan specifically to drain his last $3,000. Where did the money come from?" "That's the strange part," Albright said. "It didn't come from a local crop sale or a government subsidy. It was a wire transfer. Originated from a blind trust, LLC, based out of Delaware. The Blue Horizon Trust." Ryan's blood ran cold. Blind trusts, Delaware LLCs, sudden massive wire transfers. These were the tools of corporate maneuvering, not desperate vegetable farmers. "Send me the wire details." Now," Ryan snapped, hanging up the phone. He immediately called his brother Harrison. 30 minutes later, the two of them were driving their luxury SUV out toward the eastern ridge, trailing a plume of dust in their wake. "You're overreacting, Ryan," Harrison said, adjusting his expensive sunglasses. "Maybe Paul had a rich uncle die. Maybe he hit the state lottery. The guy is a dirt farmer. He doesn't know how to set up a Delaware LLC." "Exactly," Ryan countered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "He doesn't, which means someone set it up for him, someone with serious money. And I want to know why someone with serious money is bailing out Jonathan Paul." As they crested the limestone ridge overlooking the Devil's Pan, Ryan slammed on the brakes. The barren, chalky basin was no longer empty. The rusted, decoy water drilling rig was still there, but something else had been added. A towering, commercial-grade chain-link fence, topped with angled barbed wire, was currently being erected around the perimeter of the 40 acres. A crew of rough-looking men in high-visibility vests were pouring concrete posts. "What the hell is this?" Harrison muttered, pulling off his sunglasses. "He's fencing in 40 acres of toxic dirt?" Ryan drove the SUV aggressively down the ridge, stopping mere inches from where Jonathan was standing near a flatbed truck, inspecting a roll of heavy fencing wire. Jonathan looked up, his expression unreadable as the Caldwell brothers stepped out of their vehicle. He had known this day would come. Gideon Croft had warned him the money transfer might trigger alarms, but they had needed the funds to secure the physical site before the federal permits went public. "Jonathan," Ryan said smoothly, though his eyes darted around the site, taking in every detail. "We were just in the neighborhood. Looks like you've come into some money. This is an expensive perimeter for a failed water well. Got tired of the teenagers from town driving their dirt bikes over my property," Jonathan replied calmly, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "And the water well isn't a failure. I'm just digging deeper, hitting hard rock, need to secure the equipment." Harrison scoffed. "You're pouring concrete and stringing razor wire to protect a rusted piece of junk drill? Who paid for this, Jonathan? Word at the bank is you've got phantom investors." "My finances are my business, Harrison. Just like my land is my business," Jonathan said, his voice dropping an octave. "Land that I own free and clear, thanks to you." Ryan stepped closer, invading Jonathan's personal space. He looked past Jonathan, his eyes narrowing as he observed the drilling rig. Ryan wasn't a geologist, but he had overseen enough commercial developments to know it heavy machinery. "That's a rotary core drill," Ryan said softly. "You don't use a diamond-tipped core drill to tap an aquifer, Jonathan. You use that to pull solid geological samples." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, but his face remained a mask of calm. "It was the only rig I could afford at the auction. It digs a hole. That's all I care about." Ryan stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. The power dynamic had shifted, and Ryan could feel it in his bones. The desperate, cowering farmer from Miller's Diner was gone. The man standing before him was confident, anchored, and utterly unafraid. "You're hiding something, Paul," Ryan whispered, his voice laced with venom. "I don't know what it is yet, but this was my grandfather's land. If you think you found a way to make a dime off this wasteland, you are sorely mistaken. I will bury you." "You already tried to bury me, Ryan," Jonathan replied, stepping forward so he was nose to nose with the billionaire. "The difference is I know how to dig." Ryan held the stare for a second longer before turning on his heel. "Let's go, Harrison." As they drove back toward town, the silence in the SUV was suffocating. Harrison looked at his brother. "What do you think he's doing out there? Gold? Oil?" "There's no oil in that basin, and the geology is wrong for gold," Ryan snapped, his mind racing. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Yeah, it's Ryan Caldwell," he barked into the receiver. "I need you to get out to the county clerk's office, pull every permit, every zoning request, every scrap of paper Jonathan Paul has filed in the last 6 months. And call our private investigator in Chicago, track down a Blue Horizon Trust in Delaware." 2 days later, the storm broke. Ryan was in his office when the private investigator called back. The investigator hadn't found the true owner of the blind trust, but he had found something far more damning. He had tracked the legal representative who incorporated the LLC. "The lawyer of record is Gideon Croft," the investigator reported over the speakerphone. Ryan froze. "Croft, the mining attorney, the guy who broke the Sterling. Wait." Ryan caught himself. He knew Croft's reputation. Croft didn't deal in water rights. Croft didn't deal in agricultural disputes. Gideon Croft exclusively represented independent claims on rare earth metals and billion-dollar resource veins. "That's not all, Mr. Caldwell," the investigator continued. "I have a contact at the Federal Bureau of Land Management. An environmental impact notice just crossed the wire this morning for Oak Haven County. It's an application for commercial extraction." "Extraction of what?" Ryan demanded, the air leaving his lungs. "Lithium, sir. A high-yield hectorite claystone matrix. The coordinates match a 40-acre parcel on the eastern ridge. Preliminary federal estimates put the surface-level reserves at roughly $25 million. The applicant is Jonathan Paul. The phone slipped from Ryan's hand, clattering onto the mahogany desk. The investigator's voice kept talking, but Ryan couldn't hear him. The blood rushed to his ears, a deafening roar of humiliation, rage, and profound greed. $25 million. He had sold a $25 million lithium mine. For $3,000. He had mocked the man to his face. He had laughed as he signed away the mineral rights. Harrison walked into the office, seeing his brother pale and trembling. "Ryan, what is it? What did he find?" Ryan slowly looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He swept his arm across his desk, sending his laptop, coffee mug, and papers smashing against the far wall in a violent explosion of glass and plastic. "He played us," Ryan roared, the sound tearing from his throat like a wounded animal. "That dirt farmer played us. He stole our land. He stole our lithium." Harrison stepped back, stunned. Lithium? The devil's pan? Ryan braced his hands on the empty desk, his breathing heavy, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying resolve. The game of small-town intimidation was over. This was a corporate war. "Call the lawyers. Call the judge. Call everyone," Ryan sneered, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I don't care if we have to burn his farmhouse to the ground. I don't care if we have to bleed him in court until he dies of old age. We are taking that land back." The legal assault began exactly 48 hours after Ryan Caldwell shattered his office. Jonathan was served with a massive stack of injunction papers by a smirking county sheriff's deputy. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal fiction, drafted by the Caldwells' high-priced corporate firm in the city. It alleged fraud, deceptive practices, and the doctrine of mutual mistake. It claimed Jonathan had deliberately withheld geological data prior to the sale, data he supposedly possessed, to steal the Caldwell family's ancestral mineral wealth. The lawsuit demanded an immediate, indefinite halt to all activity on the Devil's Pan until the property's ownership could be litigated. The hearing was fast-tracked and set for a Tuesday morning in the Oakhaven County Courthouse, presided over by Judge Thomas Higgins. Higgins was a man who owed his re-election campaigns entirely to the Caldwell's dark money PACs. He had golfed with Ryan's father and attended Harrison's wedding. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. Jonathan walked into the oak-paneled courtroom wearing his only suit, which fit loosely across his shoulders. Charlotte walked beside him, her head held high despite the suffocating tension in the room. The Caldwell brothers sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 4 immaculate attorneys in tailored silk suits. Ryan caught Jonathan's eye and offered a slow, predatory smile. It was the smile of a man who owned the battlefield. Gideon Croft was not there. "Case of Caldwell Holdings versus Paul," Judge Higgins droned, adjusting his reading glasses. He looked down at Jonathan with thinly veiled disdain. "Mr. Paul, I see you are unrepresented. Given the severity of the plaintiff's injunction request, I am inclined to grant an immediate cease and desist on your property to prevent the spoliation of contested, high-value assets." "Your Honor," Jonathan started, his voice dry. "My attorney was supposed to be—" The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud thud. Gideon Croft strolled down the center aisle, a battered leather briefcase swinging at his side. He wore his trademark rumpled suit and a bemused expression, as if he had just wandered into a mildly entertaining school play. "Apologies for the delay, Your Honor," Croft said, his gravelly voice carrying effortlessly to the rafters. Traffic on the interstate was murder, Gideon Croft representing Mr. Paul. One of the Caldwell's slick attorneys stood up. "Your Honor, Mr. Croft has not filed a notice of appearance with this court. Furthermore, this injunction requires immediate ruling. I haven't filed a notice of appearance, Counselor, because I have no intention of appearing in this court," Croft replied, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a thick, blue-backed document and slapped it onto the clerk's desk. "Your Honor, I am filing a motion for immediate removal to the United States District Court, for the Northern District of Illinois. Judge Higgins frowned, his face reddening. On what grounds, Mr. Croft? This is a local real estate dispute. Not anymore, it isn't, Croft said, turning to look directly at Ryan Caldwell. As of 8 a.m. yesterday, the Devil's Pan was officially designated a federal critical mineral exploration zone under the Department of Energy's new Domestic Supply Chain Initiative. The EPA has granted preliminary extraction clearance based on interstate commerce parameters. You are attempting to freeze an operation heavily subsidized by federal grants, and furthermore, you are attempting to litigate mineral rights that have already been registered across state lines by a Delaware trust. Croft leaned against the wooden partition, grinning like a wolf. This court no longer has jurisdiction. If the Caldwells want to freeze my client's lithium, they can try to convince a federal judge in Chicago why they accidentally sold $25 million of rare earth minerals for $3,000 and are now throwing a tantrum about it. The courtroom erupted into whispers. The lead Caldwell attorney scrambled to read the document Croft had dropped. His face went entirely pale. He leaned down and whispered furiously into Ryan's ear. Judge Higgins slammed his gavel, though he looked visibly shaken. I will review this motion in chambers, but if this federal designation is accurate, this court is compelled to stay all local proceedings. We are adjourned. Jonathan exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for days. Beside him, Charlotte squeezed his hand, a fierce spark of hope in her eyes. But as they turned to leave, Jonathan looked at Ryan Caldwell. The smugness was gone from Ryan's face. In its place was a cold, calculating fury. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a fit. He just stared at Jonathan with dead eyes, communicating a silent, chilling promise. The legal route had been blocked. Now the dirty war would begin. By the end of the week, the Caldwells' invisible grip on Oakhaven tightened around Jonathan's throat. It started at the diesel supplier. Jonathan's account, which he had just paid in full, was abruptly closed. Equipment shortage, the manager muttered, refusing to meet Jonathan's eyes. Without thousands of gallons of diesel, the heavy drilling and extraction equipment on the Devil's Pan would grind to a halt. Next was the grocery store. Charlotte's debit card was declined at the register, despite the Blue Horizon Trust having wired thousands into their local checking account. The bank manager, Dennis Albright, claimed it was an automated fraud hold that could take weeks to clear. Finally, the local contractors Jonathan had hired to reinforce the fencing and build the initial processing sheds simply didn't show up. When Jonathan drove to the foreman's house to demand answers, the man handed Jonathan his deposit check back, looking terrified. "I'm sorry, Art, but Caldwell Holdings owns the mortgage on my shop. Ryan said if my crew steps foot on your dirt, he's calling in my loans by Friday. I can't lose my business over your lithium." They were starving him out. They were trying to make the land so impossible to work, so logistically toxic, that Jonathan would miss his federal benchmark deadlines for extraction, thereby invalidating his permits. "We can't fight the whole town, Jonathan," Charlotte said that night, looking out the kitchen window toward the dark horizon. Jonathan picked up his phone, dialing a logistics company 3 states over. "We don't need the town," Jonathan said grimly. "We have the Delaware Trust. We're going to pay a premium, but we are bringing in out-of-state diesel, out-of-state contractors, and out-of-state security. Ryan Caldwell wants to play dirty, fine. We're putting up a wall he can't buy." Ryan Caldwell paced his sprawling living room, a glass of expensive bourbon trembling slightly in his grip. His legal team had informed him that breaking Gideon Croft's federal shield would take at least 2 years and millions of dollars in litigation, time Jonathan Paul would use to strip the lithium from the ground and become wealthy enough to fight back indefinitely. Economic starvation was slowing Paul down, but out-of-state tankers were already rolling into Oakhaven, bringing the fuel and supplies the local boys had refused to sell. Paul was too stubborn to die quietly. "We need a kill shot," Ryan muttered to Harrison, who was slouched on the leather sofa. "If he starts hauling raw ore out of that basin, we lose. Forever." Harrison swirled his drink. "So what do you want to do? Shoot him?" "No," Ryan snapped. "You don't kill the man. You kill the land. The EPA gave him clearance because the extraction process is supposedly clean. But if the regional EPA director gets an anonymous tip that Paul's operation is leaking highly toxic industrial solvents into the deep aquifer, they won't just freeze his permits. They will revoke them entirely, slap him with a massive environmental cleanup fine, and throw him in federal prison for ecological terrorism. Harrison sat up, his eyes widening. You want to poison the devil's pan? I want to poison his dream, Ryan corrected coldly. That evening, Ryan made a cash withdrawal from a private safe and drove to a dilapidated auto body shop on the outskirts of the county. He met with a man named Boyd, a local enforcer known for handling the Caldwell's less savory evictions and intimidation tactics. Ryan handed Boyd a thick manila envelope containing $20,000 in untraceable bills. In the back of your truck are 4 50-gallon drums of liquid hexavalent chromium and industrial benzene, Ryan instructed, his voice devoid of emotion. Highly toxic. It sinks fast and ruins water tables instantly. I want you to cut the fence on the south ridge of the Devil's Pan tonight. Dump all 200 gallons directly into the blue water in the trench. Leave the empty barrels buried in the brush near his equipment. Boyd counted the cash, a nasty grin spreading across his face. Consider it done, Mr. Caldwell. His dirt will be glowing by sunrise. At 2 a.m., a heavy, unseasonable fog rolled over the limestone ridges of the Devil's Pan, swallowing the moonlight. Boyd and 2 accomplices killed the headlights on their heavy-duty ATV, rolling silently toward the southern perimeter of Jonathan's newly erected chain-link fence. The massive diesel generators powering the work camp were shut down for the night. The site looked completely abandoned. Using heavy bolt cutters, Boyd snipped through the thick wire mesh, pulling it back to create a gap large enough for the ATV. They drove through the breach, navigating the cracked, chalky earth down toward the shimmering turquoise-blue lake at the center of the basin. Hurry it up, Boyd hissed, dropping the ATV's tailgate. Roll them to the edge and knock the bungs loose. Let it bleed into the trench. The 2 goons grunted, wrestling the first heavy steel drum of toxins to the muddy edge of the water. They pulled heavy wrenches from their belts, preparing to crack the seals. A sudden, deafening mechanical whine shattered the silence. Before Boyd could even turn his head, the entire basin exploded in blinding, brilliant white light. 6 massive halogen stadium lamps, mounted on mobile diesel light towers, hidden behind the mounds of excavated earth, snapped on simultaneously. The fog illuminated into a blinding, glowing wall, completely disorienting the saboteurs. "What the hell?" Boyd screamed, shielding his eyes and scrambling backward. "Step away from the barrels, Boyd," a voice boomed through a motorized megaphone. From the shadows behind the blinding lights stepped Jonathan Paul, but he wasn't alone. Flanking him were 4 massive, heavily armed men wearing tactical vests, the elite private security contractors Jonathan had imported from Chicago with the trust money. Jonathan held a pump-action shotgun resting casually against his hip. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying resolve. He had known Ryan wouldn't stop at the courthouse. He had known the Caldwells would try to break the land itself. Boyd panicked. He lunged for the ATV, reaching for a pistol tucked under the driver's seat. Clack, clack. Jonathan racked the shotgun, the sound echoing like a cannon blast against the limestone ridges. The 4 security contractors simultaneously raised their rifles, training the laser sights directly onto Boyd's chest. "I wouldn't," Jonathan said softly, his voice carrying over the humming stadium lights. "You're trespassing on federal exploration land with intent to distribute hazardous biocontaminants. These gentlemen behind me are authorized to use lethal force to protect a billion-dollar federal asset. Put your hands on your head." Boyd froze, looking at the red dots painting his chest. He slowly raised his hands, his bravado entirely evaporating. His 2 goons immediately dropped to their knees, terrified. Jonathan signaled to his head of security, a towering ex-military man named Hank. Hank moved in, zip-tying the men's wrists and securing the ATV. Hank inspected the barrels, reading the faded hazardous material placards. He looked back at Jonathan, shaking his head in disgust. "Chromium and benzene, Mr. Paul. If they had dumped this, it would have poisoned the water table for 50 miles. The EPA would have crucified you. Jonathan walked slowly up to Boyd, the crushed chalk crunching under his boots. He looked the thug dead in the eye. "I know Ryan Caldwell paid you to do this," Jonathan said quietly. "And I know Ryan Caldwell is too smart to give you a check, but he's arrogant enough to think you wouldn't get caught." Jonathan reached into Boyd's heavy jacket pocket. He pulled out the thick manila envelope. He ripped it open, exposing the stacks of $100 bills. But Jonathan wasn't looking at the money. He turned the envelope over. Printed faintly in the top left corner, barely visible in the glaring light, was a custom gold foil stamp. Caldwell Holdings, Executive Office. Ryan had pulled the envelope straight from his own desk. Jonathan held the envelope up to Boyd's face. "Grand theft, trespassing, and federal environmental terrorism. You're looking at 20 years in a concrete box, Boyd, unless you want to tell the FBI exactly who handed you this envelope." Boyd swallowed hard, the sweat beading on his forehead. "Oh, if I roll on the Caldwells, they'll kill me." "If you don't," Jonathan replied, his eyes colder than the winter frost, "I'm going to have my men lock you in the shed with these barrels until the federal marshals arrive from Chicago. Your choice." Boyd broke. "He gave it to me tonight, at his office. He told me to poison the water so the EPA would shut you down. I'll testify. Just keep me away from him." Jonathan stepped back, lowering the shotgun. He had him. He didn't just have his land secured. He now had the physical evidence to tie the wealthiest man in Oak Haven to a federal crime. But as the security team hauled Boyd and his crew away, Jonathan's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Charlotte. "Jonathan," Charlotte's voice came through, trembling with a panic he had never heard before. "Jonathan, you need to come home right now. Something's wrong. Someone's outside the house." Jonathan's blood ran completely to ice. He had fortified the Devil's Pan. He had guarded the lithium. But in his obsession to protect his new empire, he had left his old world vulnerable. The Caldwells had sent a distraction to the mine, while the real target was alone in the dark. Jonathan dropped the phone, the cold dread instantly transmuting into blind, adrenaline-fueled rage. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. He just sprinted for his heavy 3/4-ton pickup truck. Hank, recognizing the sheer terror in his boss's eyes, didn't ask questions. The massive security chief simply signaled to one of his tactical operators, and the two men vaulted into the bed of Jonathan's truck, their rifles still hot in their hands. Jonathan threw the truck into gear, the tires spinning violently on the crushed chalk before catching traction. He tore out of the Devil's Pan, ignoring the dirt road entirely and cutting straight across the open prairie. The farmhouse was 12 miles away, in the pitch-black night, with the speedometer needle burying itself past 90. Jonathan prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to since the drought began. "If they touch her," Jonathan whispered to the dark cab, his hands choking the steering wheel. "If they lay one hand on her, I will end them." Back at the farmhouse, the night was entirely still, save for the heavy thud of boots on the wooden wraparound porch. Charlotte crouched beneath the kitchen window, her back pressed against the floral wallpaper she had hung 10 years ago. In her trembling hands, she gripped Jonathan's 12-gauge hunting rifle. A box of shells spilled across the linoleum floor beside her. Outside, a sleek, black, luxury SUV was parked on the front lawn, its headlights intentionally cutting through the living room windows to blind anyone looking out. "Oh, Charlotte, open the door," a slurred, arrogant voice shouted from the porch. Charlotte squeezed her eyes shut. It was Harrison Caldwell. He sounded drunk, erratic, and deeply unhinged. "We know Jonathan is out playing minor in the dirt," Harrison yelled, his heavy fist pounding against the reinforced oak door. "We just want the original deed, Charlotte. Ryan says the lawyers need the hard copy. You slide the paper under the door, and we drive away. If you don't, well, old farmhouses with faulty wiring catch fire all the time, don't they?" Charlotte heard the unmistakable glug of liquid being poured onto the dry wooden planks of the porch. The sharp, overwhelming stench of gasoline seeped under the doorframe. "Harrison, I swear to God I have a rifle," Charlotte screamed, her voice cracking. "You light that match and I will shoot straight through this door." Harrison laughed, a cruel, echoing sound. "You don't have the nerve, Charlotte. You're dirt. We own this town, we own you. Now give me the damn deed. He struck a match. The brilliant flare illuminated his twisted, grinning face in the window glass. He lowered it toward the gasoline-soaked wood. Suddenly, a blinding pair of high beams crested the hill, leading up to the driveway. A massive engine roared, the sound amplifying like a freight train. Harrison whipped his head around just in time to see Jonathan's heavy pickup truck leave the gravel driveway entirely, launching over the drainage ditch. Jonathan didn't hit the brakes. He aimed his heavy steel bumper directly at the passenger side of Harrison's luxury SUV. Crash! The impact was deafening. The 3-ton pickup crumpled the side of the SUV, shoving the $200,000 vehicle sideways across the lawn until it slammed into a massive oak tree, shattering glass and hissing steam into the night air. Before the truck had even fully settled, Jonathan kicked his door open. Hank and the tactical operator vaulted from the truck bed, sweeping the perimeter with blinding weapon-mounted lights. Harrison stood frozen on the porch, the unlit match still in his hand, his mouth hanging open in shock. The man he had brought with him, a junior associate from the bank, screamed and threw his hands in the air, instantly dropping to his knees on the grass. Jonathan didn't say a word. He walked up the porch steps with terrifying, deliberate slowness. The sheer, predatory violence radiating from him caused Harrison to stumble backward, slipping on the gasoline he had just poured. "Jonathan, wait, it was a joke," Harrison stammered, raising his hands, the liquid sloshing around his expensive loafers. "We were just trying to scare you into a negotiation," Ryan said. Jonathan's right hook was blindingly fast. His heavy, calloused fist connected directly with Harrison's jaw. The billionaire's brother went down like a felled tree, his head cracking sharply against the wooden siding of the house. He collapsed into a heap, out cold, before he even hit the floorboards. Charlotte unbolted the door and threw it open, throwing herself into Jonathan's arms. He dropped his stoic facade, wrapping her in a crushing embrace, burying his face in her hair as he breathed in the scent of her, verifying she was unharmed. "I'm okay, Jonathan. I'm okay," Charlotte whispered, pulling back to look at his face. "You stopped them." Hank stepped onto the porch, looking down at the unconscious Harrison and the puddle of gasoline. He keyed his shoulder radio. "Base, this is Echo 1. We have a 1015 at the primary residence. Attempted arson. Assailant is down." He looked at Jonathan. "Mr. Paul, we have Boyd locked in the shed with the chemicals, and we have Harrison Caldwell sleeping in a puddle of premium unleaded. I think it's time to make the call." Jonathan nodded, his heart finally settling into a steady, rhythmic beat of absolute victory. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed the Chicago number he had memorized months ago. Gideon Croft answered on the second ring. "Jonathan, it's 3 a.m. Tell me you have good news." "Gideon," Jonathan said, his voice ringing clear and authoritative into the night. "The federal shield held. They tried to break the land with benzene, and they tried to break my family with fire. We have the men, we have the evidence, and we have the Caldwell name on the envelope. Send the bureau, send everyone." Croft chuckled, a low, gravelly sound of pure satisfaction. "Hold your ground, Jonathan. The sun is about to rise on Oak Haven." The following morning, Ryan Caldwell arrived at the executive suite of Caldwell Holdings at 7 a.m. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, feeling a knot of nervous tension tightening in his stomach. Boyd hadn't checked in. Harrison wasn't answering his phone. Ryan walked to his massive window, looking down at the sleepy town of Oak Haven. It was his town. He had always controlled it. Whatever had gone wrong in the night, his lawyers would fix it. They always did. Then he saw them. Turning off the main highway and entering the town square was a procession of vehicles that did not belong in Oak Haven. 4 black, unmarked Subarus, followed by 2 massive dark blue command trucks bearing the gold seals of the FBI and the Environmental Protection Agency. Behind them were 3 Oak Haven County Sheriff's cruisers, though the deputies inside looked terrified. Ryan watched in silent horror as the convoy pulled directly into the parking lot of the Caldwell Holdings building. Dozens of agents wearing tactical vests spilled out, establishing a perimeter. "No," Ryan whispered, dropping his coffee mug. It shattered on the hardwood floor, dark liquid seeping into the expensive rug. No, this is impossible. 5 minutes later, the reinforced mahogany doors of Ryan's office were violently kicked open. Special Agent Miller of the FBI strode into the room, flanked by 2 armed U.S. Marshals. Behind them walked Gideon Croft, looking entirely out of place in his rumpled suit, holding a leather briefcase and smiling like a cat who had just swallowed a very fat canary. "Ryan Caldwell," Agent Miller announced, producing a thick stack of warrants. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal environmental terrorism, racketeering, and attempted arson of a dwelling. Hands behind your back." Ryan backed up against his desk, his face a mask of pale, desperate denial. "This is a mistake. You have no evidence. I am the largest employer in this county. We have an envelope with your corporate seal, full of untraceable cash, a confession from a man named Boyd, and your brother singing like a choir boy in a holding cell," Miller said flatly. As he spoke, the marshals grabbed Ryan's arms, forcing them behind his back and clicking the heavy steel handcuffs into place. As Ryan was hauled aggressively toward the door, he locked eyes with Gideon Croft. "You tell Paul he'll never mind that land," Ryan spat, his composure entirely broken, spit flying from his lips. "I'll tie it up in appellate court until the sun burns out. The mutual mistake suit will bankrupt him." Croft stepped aside to let the marshals drag Ryan through the doorway, leaning in close as they passed. "Oh, Ryan, you haven't checked the morning dockets," Croft said softly. "The mutual mistake injunction was dismissed with extreme prejudice an hour ago. Turns out, when you attempt to murder the defendant and poison the disputed asset, federal judges tend to frown on your civil claims. The Devil's Pan belongs to Jonathan Paul, and as of 10 minutes ago, the federal government has frozen all assets of Caldwell Holdings and the Oak Haven Savings and Loan, pending a RICO investigation." Ryan stopped struggling, the color drained completely from his face, leaving behind a hollow, empty shell of a man. The empire his grandfather had built, the town he had squeezed dry, the legacy he had weaponized, all of it was gone. Evaporated by a farmer he had tried to humiliate for $3,000. As Ryan was led out to the waiting cruisers, the townspeople of Oak Haven began to emerge from their shops and homes, watching the architect of their misery being stuffed into the back of a federal vehicle. There was no cheering, just a profound, stunned silence as the shadow lifted. 1 year later, the eastern ridge of Oak Haven was no longer a barren, chalky wasteland. The Devil's Pan had been entirely transformed into the Paul Aris extraction facility. It was a marvel of modern, environmentally conscious engineering. Instead of massive open-pit mines, a network of sleek, enclosed pumping stations extracted the blue clay, processed the lithium safely off-site, and returned the purified water back to the deep aquifer. The facility employed over 300 local workers, paying union wages and offering full benefits. Jonathan Paul stood on the balcony of his new, modest administrative office, looking out over the gleaming silver tanks and the bustling activity below. He wore a crisp pair of jeans and a clean work shirt, his hands still bearing the calluses of a lifetime of labor. The door opened behind him, and Charlotte stepped out onto the balcony, holding a thick ledger. She was now the director of the Oak Haven Community Trust, a foundation funded entirely by the lithium profits. "The final auction paperwork just cleared," Charlotte said, smiling warmly. "The old Caldwell properties that the feds seized. We just bought the last 2,000 acres. Jonathan turned around, resting his hands on the railing. "And the deeds?" "Already transferred," Charlotte replied. "We're leasing the land back to the independent farmers for $1 a year on 99-year terms. Though the bank can never touch them again." Jonathan looked back out at the horizon, where the green summer prairie met the bright blue sky. The men who had tried to bury him were currently sitting in federal penitentiaries, stripped of their wealth and their power. They had thought the land was worthless. They had thought he was worthless. They had sold him a grave for $3,000, but Jonathan Paul knew something the Caldwells never did. If you plant a seed in the darkest, hardest dirt, and you fight for it with everything you have, eventually you bring forth life. What a satisfying end to the Caldwell Empire. If Jonathan's ultimate revenge and the redemption of Oakhaven had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share this story with a friend who loves seeing the arrogant get exactly what they deserve. Let us know in the comments below. If you bought a piece of land and discovered it held a massive fortune, would you keep it a secret or build an empire right away? Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible true-to-life story.